He lived in patterns that never changed. The alarm clock rang. His hand searched for the button, and the day began in the same way as yesterday. Breakfast was rushed, the commute was mechanical, work filled the hours with tasks that felt endless but empty. At night, he came home, scrolled through his phone, watched meaningless videos, and finally went to sleep, already knowing that the next day would repeat itself. Life moved forward, but he stayed in place. From the outside, nothing seemed broken. He had enough to survive. There was food on the table, bills were paid, and no major disaster had struck his home. But inside, a quiet dissatisfaction grew. It was not loud enough to be called pain, but it was heavy enough to be felt every day. A sense of lost time lingered in his mind, like sand slipping through his fingers. Each time he looked into the mirror, he noticed the difference. His reflection was older, but not stronger. The eyes that once carried energy now seemed tired, even when he had slept well. He remembered moments from his past when he was full of dreams, ready to try new things, full of fire. Now, that fire was almost gone, reduced to ashes. He tried to convince himself that this was how life worked, that adults must sacrifice excitement for routine. But the truth pressed against his thoughts. It was not life itself that stole his passion. It was his own acceptance of comfort, his silent agreement to stop growing. The nights were the hardest. In silence, when distractions were gone, the whispers inside grew louder. He asked himself if this was all there was: work, eat, sleep, repeat. Deep down, he knew he wanted more, but fear and habit built walls around him. He kept remembering the plans he once wrote down, the skills he wanted to learn, the travels he promised himself, the career he imagined, the person he wanted to become. All of it stayed on paper, waiting. And with every month that passed, the distance between who he was and who he could be grew wider. There was no single tragedy, but the weight of small wasted days. Every sunset felt like a reminder that time was not waiting. Friends moved forward, strangers achieved dreams. The world kept changing, and yet he stood still. The fear that another year might pass with no real progress created restlessness he could not hide from anymore. It did not happen with noise or fireworks. The shift came quietly, like a light turning on in a dark room. For the first time, he stopped lying to himself. He admitted that he was not living fully, that he was only surviving. That admission hurt, but it was also powerful. It meant there was still something alive inside him, a part that refused to give up completely. And so, in that silent moment, he woke up in a new way. Not from sleep, but from numbness. He realized change could not wait for the future. Change had to begin now. It came suddenly, not as a single dramatic event, but as a series of moments that together formed a breaking point. One day at work, he made a mistake,
on a simple task, something he had done many times before. His mind had wandered, his focus was weak, and the result was failure. The criticism he received was not unusual, but this time it cut deeper. It was not about the mistake itself. It was about what the mistake revealed. He saw how little energy he gave to his days, how little passion he carried into his actions. The realization left him unsettled. Soon after, his health began to send small warnings. Fatigue stayed with him longer than usual. His body felt heavier, his posture weaker, his mind slower to respond. The mirror not only showed a tired face, but also a body that carried the weight of neglect. He understood that years of comfort and routine had not only stolen his dreams, but also his strength. The final spark came when he watched someone else succeed. It was not jealousy, but a sharp contrast. A person with fewer resources, less stability, and more obstacles had managed to create something meaningful. He compared this to his own life and felt the emptiness more clearly than ever. It was as if the world was holding up a mirror not of his present, but of what he refused to become if he continued to waste his time. All these moments combined into a challenge he could no longer ignore. The truth became unavoidable. His old ways had failed him. The path he walked every day was safe but dead. It led to survival, not growth, and survival without purpose was another form of slow death. He felt anger at himself, but also a strange kind of energy, as if the pain of disappointment carried within it the seeds of transformation. He realized that the challenge was not outside of him. It was not the job, not the economy, not the opinions of others. The true battle lived inside his own mind. The excuses he repeated, the fears he obeyed, the habits he protected, these were the real enemies. Every time he postponed action, every time he told himself that tomorrow was better, he was building the walls of his own prison. The call for change was no longer a whisper. It was loud, unavoidable, demanding. The failures, the fatigue, the comparisons, all spoke the same message. Stay the same and remain stuck, or face the discomfort and begin again. He understood now that the cost of staying where he was had become greater than the cost of change. That realization hurt, but it also cleared the path ahead. For the first time, he saw his pain not as punishment, but as a guide. The failures pointed to lessons he had ignored. The fatigue warned him to care for his body. The mirror of other people's success reminded him that growth was possible even in harder conditions. The challenge was not to avoid suffering, but to transform it into strength. In that moment, he accepted the call, not with confidence, not with certainty, but with awareness. The life he had lived so far had reached its limit. The next chapter would demand risk, effort, and sacrifice. He understood that nothing would change unless he did. And so, with fear still present but no longer in control, he stepped into the unknown, carrying only one clear decision: he would no longer turn away from the challenge.
He did not transform overnight. The decision to change was powerful, but the reality of action was humbler, smaller, and filled with hesitation. His first step was not heroic. It was simple, almost invisible to others, but it carried the weight of a new beginning. One evening, instead of losing himself in endless scrolling, he picked up a book that had been sitting on his shelf for months. He opened the first page and read slowly. The words felt heavy at first. His mind wanted to wander, but he kept going. That single page became the first stone laid on a new path. The following morning, he made another choice. He woke up slightly earlier than usual and stretched his body for a few minutes. It was nothing compared to the fitness routines he once imagined, but it was enough to remind his muscles that they were alive. He felt clumsy, unprepared, but when he finished, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had acted differently. Every small action seemed to carry resistance. His mind tried to convince him that it was pointless, that one page of reading or a few minutes of movement would not change his life. Yet he began to understand that the point was not about immediate change. It was about proving to himself that he could act, even in the smallest way. Every time he ignored the voice of doubt and completed the action, he chipped away at the walls of his old habits. He started writing short notes in a notebook, capturing thoughts, goals, and reflections. At first, the pages were messy, his handwriting rushed, his ideas unclear. But over time, the notebook became a place of honesty, a mirror that reflected both his struggles and his progress. It was there that he admitted his fears, his weaknesses, and also recorded his small victories. The act of writing turned his abstract desire for change into something visible, something real. There were setbacks. Some days he skipped reading, other days he ignored exercise, and many times he felt the pull of his old routine. But each time he returned to the new habits, even after failing, he noticed a shift inside. The failures no longer erased his progress. They became part of the process. He understood that growth was not about perfection, but about persistence. He began to notice small results. After a week of reading, he had new ideas, words, and perspectives in his mind. After a few weeks of stretching, his body felt lighter, his energy slightly stronger. The changes were not dramatic, but they were real. These small wins fueled him to keep going. He started to trust the process,
even if the results were not yet visible to the outside world. The first step was not glamorous. It was filled with self-doubt, awkward effort, and invisible victories. But it carried within it the most important lesson. Action created momentum. Even a single page, a single note, or a single movement mattered. By taking these small steps, he was building something far greater than the actions themselves. He was building discipline, confidence, and proof that he could move forward, no matter how slow the pace. And so, with each repeated action, he created the foundation of his new life. What once felt impossible now began to feel possible, not because the road had become easier, but because he had finally taken the first step.
The path forward was never straight. Once the excitement of beginning faded, the weight of resistance returned with greater strength. He faced mornings when the alarm rang, but his body begged for more sleep. He faced evenings when the comfort of old habits whispered louder than the promise of progress. The discipline he was trying to build was tested by fatigue, by doubt, and by the opinions of others who could not see the invisible effort he carried inside. Every small habit he had started seemed fragile. On some days, he broke them without even realizing. He skipped reading, convinced himself that one day did not matter, and returned to his phone for distraction. He missed his exercise, telling himself he would do more tomorrow. But tomorrow often looked the same as yesterday. The cycle of progress and setback weighed heavily on him, and he wondered if he was strong enough to keep moving forward. The people around him did not always make it easier. Some laughed at his small routines, calling them unnecessary or childish. Others reminded him that he had tried to change before and failed, their words carrying the weight of past disappointments. Each comment pressed against his fragile confidence, forcing him to question whether his efforts had any real value. There were also moments of isolation. While others enjoyed the comfort of entertainment or social gatherings, he spent time alone with his books, his notes, and his small exercises. The loneliness was sharp, and the temptation to return to the comfort of old habits grew stronger. He often asked himself if the sacrifices were worth it, if the pain of discipline would ever lead to something greater. His body resisted too. Muscles ached after new movements. His mind grew tired after deep reading, and his willpower seemed to drain faster than it could recover. The work was not only physical or mental, it was emotional. He had to fight against his own fears of failure, his impatience for results, and the constant voice that told him to give up. Yet within these trials, something unexpected began to grow. Each time he failed, but returned to the path, he discovered resilience. Each time he faced criticism, but continued anyway, he discovered courage. Each time he chose discipline over comfort, even for a single action, he discovered strength he had not known before. The struggles
were not signs of weakness. They were signs of transformation. He realized that growth was not measured by how easy the journey felt, but by how he responded when it became hard. The resistance was not the enemy, it was the training ground. The setbacks were not the end, they were the proof that he was moving beyond his limits. The trials continued, shaping him in silence. The small routines that once felt like a burden became anchors holding him steady. The loneliness that once felt heavy became space for reflection. The criticism that once hurt deeply became background noise he no longer obeyed. The journey through these trials was slow, but it was changing him from the inside out. He no longer looked for quick results. Instead, he learned to value persistence, to trust the process, and to see every obstacle as part of his education. The tests of discipline, patience, and courage did not stop him. They built him. And though the road remained uncertain, he carried within him a new understanding. Every struggle was shaping the strength he needed for the path ahead.
After weeks of struggle, something began to shift. The actions that once felt heavy and unnatural slowly turned into habits that carried their own rhythm. He no longer had to fight with the same intensity to open a book or stretch his body. The resistance was still there, but it was weaker, as if his mind had finally started to accept a new way of living. He noticed the difference first in small details. Reading that once felt like a task now pulled him in with curiosity. Movement that once caused pain now brought energy. Writing that once felt forced now became a daily need, a way to clear his thoughts and sharpen his focus. The results were not sudden, but they were undeniable. His body carried more energy throughout the day. His conversations felt sharper because his mind was filled with new words and ideas. Even his sleep became deeper, and he woke with more clarity. These changes were small on their own, but together they formed a momentum that was impossible to ignore. For the first time, he felt that progress was real, that his efforts were not wasted, and that the life he once imagined was not so distant. Opportunities began to appear where before there had only been closed doors. At work, he contributed ideas with more confidence, and people started to notice. Friends who once dismissed his efforts now asked him how he managed to stay consistent. Even strangers reacted differently, sensing a quiet confidence in his presence. The world outside seemed to change, but in truth, it was he who had changed first, and the world was only reflecting it back. The breakthrough was not a single event, but a series of realizations that built on each other. He understood that discipline was no longer something he had to borrow from motivation. It was something he owned. He understood that his pain had been the price of growth, not a sign of weakness. He understood that change was not about waiting for inspiration,
but about showing up again and again until the results could no longer hide. One evening, as he looked at the notebook he had been filling with thoughts and goals, he noticed how far he had come. The first pages were filled with confusion and doubt, but the later ones carried clarity and purpose. His handwriting was steadier, his words more confident. He realized that he had built not just habits, but a new identity. He was no longer the person who postponed his dreams. He had become the kind of person who acted even when it was hard. The shift was deeper than achievements. It was not only about the energy in his body or the words in his mind. It was about the way he saw himself. He no longer carried the same weight of helplessness. He no longer believed that change was impossible. He had proof written into his days, proof that small actions done consistently could rewrite an entire life. This breakthrough gave him a new sense of freedom. He was no longer controlled by old habits, old doubts, or old fears. He could see that the limits he once believed in were not walls, but illusions. The breakthrough was not the end of struggle, but it was the end of paralysis. He had moved from wishing to doing, from dreaming to becoming. And now every step forward was no longer just effort, it was momentum, pulling him toward a future he had once thought was out of reach.
He entered a stage where his life no longer resembled the one he had left behind. The small steps that once demanded so much effort had built a foundation of discipline, and that discipline carried him into a rhythm of living with purpose. His mornings started differently. Instead of dragging himself into the day, he welcomed it with clarity and energy. Reading became as natural as eating. Movement became as necessary as breathing. Reflection became a quiet ritual that guided his thoughts. What had once felt like impossible tasks had turned into habits that shaped his entire identity. The changes were visible not only to him, but also to the world around him. His posture was stronger, his voice steadier, his presence calmer. People treated him differently, not because they changed, but because he had changed from within. The quiet confidence he carried began to open doors. Opportunities arrived that would never have come to the man he once was. His ability to learn, adapt, and communicate attracted respect and trust. The life that once felt small and narrow expanded into a space of growth and possibility. He began to make choices from a place of strength, not fear. Where he had once postponed decisions, now he acted. Where he had once drowned in doubt, now he trusted his discipline to carry him through. He no longer wasted hours chasing distractions because he understood the value of time. Every day felt like a step forward, even when difficulties appeared, because he knew that the trials no longer defined him, they only trained him.
The relationships around him also changed. He no longer tolerated constant negativity, and he learned to set boundaries that protected his peace. This gave space for new connections with people who encouraged growth, who celebrated progress, who supported his journey. He realized that just as his inner environment had been transformed, his outer environment also began to reflect that transformation. He was no longer surrounded by doubt, but by inspiration. What mattered most was not just the achievements or the recognition, but the deep sense of alignment he felt. For the first time in years, his actions matched his dreams. His daily choices matched his values. His vision of who he wanted to become was no longer a distant hope, but a living reality. He had built a life that did not need to be escaped from, a life where effort and meaning walked side by side. There were still challenges, but they no longer crushed him. He faced them with resilience, seeing them as opportunities to grow further. He was no longer afraid of failure, because he understood that failure was part of the process. He was no longer paralyzed by fear of judgment, because he valued his own voice above the noise of others. He no longer measured his worth by comparison, because he had built his own standard, stronger and clearer than before. This new life was not about perfection, but about progress. It was not about being free of struggle, but about facing it with courage. It was not about escaping reality, but about shaping it with intention. He had discovered that the greatest investment he could ever make was in himself, and that investment had begun to pay in ways he could never have imagined. In the end, he understood the simple truth that had been waiting for him all along. Life did not change because time passed. It changed because he decided to act. His story was proof that even the smallest step could lead to transformation, and that persistence could turn weakness into strength. The man who once lived in repetition now lived in creation. And as he stood in this new chapter, he carried with him not only the lessons of his journey, but also the unshakable belief that his future was his to build.
Thanks! Please subscribe and like. Spin a new yarn with us every week. See you there!